So you just picked up your first Japanese knife. You are so excited about it. It looks beautiful. It feels great in the hand, but maybe you're a little bit apprehensive to use it for the first time because you're worried about the maintenance requirements. Maybe you're looking for your first Japanese knife and you're a little bit apprehensive to pull the trigger because you don't know how difficult or what extra maintenance is involved in maintaining a Japanese knife. Maybe you're trying to decide between stainless or carbon. So in today's video, we're going to talk about the three main areas that you're going to want to focus on to properly maintain your Japanese or European style knife. Those areas are the use, the sharpening and honing of the knife, and the storage of the knife. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the distinction between stainless steel and carbon steel. Stainless, as the name implies, will not rust or discolor, even if it's left wet or dirty after use. Of course, the name is stainless, not stain-proof, so if you push these knives to the limit, leaving them soaking in water or constantly putting them in the dishwasher, they will inevitably rust as well. Carbon steels are very prone to rust and discoloration, especially when working with acidic ingredients like tomatoes, onions, or citrus, and they must be kept dry and clean and wiped down immediately after use, or else they will develop that rust or discoloration. There are advantages, of course, to carbon steel though, namely their edge retention and their ease of sharpening, whereas stainless steels can be a little bit more difficult to sharpen and typically don't hold their edge quite as long as their carbon steel counterparts. Now there is a third option sort of between these two, which is a stainless clad knife. These knives have two layers of stainless on the outside and a layer of carbon at the core, which is only exposed at the cutting edge of the knife, about 2 to 3 millimeters depending on the knife. This is the only part of these styles of knives that will rust, so if you're looking for a carbon steel knife with slightly easier maintenance, a stainless clad knife is the way to go. Now, as I said in the intro, we're going to talk about three main areas that you'll want to focus on to properly maintain your knife, and these will change slightly depending on whether we're talking about stainless steel knives or carbon steel knives. So first, we're going to talk about the use of your knife. When working with a stainless steel or a European style blade, you can be a little bit more aggressive with the knife, rolling on your board, applying pressure down into the board as you do so, and you don't have to worry so much about the knife chipping or becoming damaged. When working around bones and other harder ingredients, these knives still can chip, especially if you're really aggressive with them or if you're prying or twisting, but generally speaking, they're a little bit more robust and less prone to damage than carbon steel. This is not only because of the steel type, but also generally speaking because of the geometry of the edge on European knives. They tend to be much thicker behind the edge, which makes the blades a little bit stronger and, one more time, less prone to chipping. Now, carbon steel knives and Japanese knives specifically are, as we've already said, prone to rust and discoloration. So during use, they must be wiped clean immediately after cutting something. This doesn't mean that if you're cutting 5 onions that you need to wipe the knife down between every onion that you cut, but it does mean that as soon as you're finished cutting your 5 onions and your knife is going to go down on the board for any length of time, the blade must get wiped down quickly with a damp towel before it goes down on the board. When cutting with the knife, it's also super duper important to make sure you're using a straight forward, backwards, or straight up and down motion. Any twisting or torquing the knife into the board as we're using a rocking motion and twisting at the same time will almost certainly cause chipping damage to occur to your knife. This is because Japanese knives are ground very, very thin behind the edge, and carbon steel is a little bit harder and therefore a little bit more brittle. This is going to contribute to an absolutely amazing cutting feel, and it's why we always recommend a Japanese knife here at Sharp Knife Shop. But you should be aware that the way you use the knife needs to change slightly if you're used to using European knives. So one more point about carbon steel before we move on is that it's not so much that it's more difficult to maintain, but that one must be more diligent in order to properly maintain it. Like we said earlier, making sure the knife gets wiped down immediately after use is super important. That's all you really need to do to properly maintain a carbon steel knife, and if rust ever does form, it's very easy to remove. Next, we're going to talk about sharpening or honing your knife. And before we really get into the differences between stainless and carbon steel in this regard, I want to make the distinction between sharpening and honing. Honing your knife is the process of realigning an existing edge on your knife. As we use our knife either in a up and down chopping motion or in a rocking motion, the edge of the knife is going to fold over one way or the other, making the knife feel slightly dull. By honing our knife or using long strokes to realign that edge, we're making our knife feel sharp again. It's important to note that honing doesn't remove material from your knife, or if it does, it's a very minimal amount of material. And if there's no edge remaining on your knife, no amount of honing is going to bring it back to life because there's no edge to realign. Once we reach this point, it's time to sharpen our knife, which we will distinguish here as the process of actually removing material from the sides of our edge to create a new edge on our knife, which we would then further hone in the later stages of our sharpening process. Sharpening can be achieved with many different techniques, but we recommend using a Japanese whetstone to sharpen your knife. Similarly, honing can be achieved in a number of different ways by either using a steel rod, a ceramic rod, or a very high grit stone. In our opinion, using a high grit stone to hone your knife on a daily basis is the best case scenario. Using a honing rod to hone your knife during prep time is a sort of second best scenario, and using a metal honing rod on a Japanese knife is not something that we recommend, as the steel typically is softer than the steel of the knife, and when we're honing we want a material that's harder than the material we're honing to get the best results. We also find that some of those metal honing rods have little ridges in them, which will cause little chip damage to your knife. If you're more interested in the honing and sharpening process, we have a video that we'll link above here on how to sharpen a knife. We talk about the differences between sharpening a stainless steel knife and sharpening a carbon steel knife. So if you're interested in that, click the link above. Another point I'd like to make is how easy it is to sharpen carbon steel knife in comparison to stainless steel. This can also be said about honing the knife. Typically, carbon steels are going to jump back to life much easier on a whetstone or when using a honing rod or a high grit stone. So if you're looking for something that has great edge retention and is easier to sharpen, basically you're looking for higher performance and you're not worried so much about maintenance, a carbon steel is a great option. Now the third area we're going to talk about is storage, and we're going to add on a little extra bit here, which is cleaning of the knife. So cleaning of both styles of knives is relatively straightforward. Both carbon steels, knives with a stainless cladding over top of carbon steel, and stainless steels can all be washed with hot soapy water. They should not be submerged in water, and you should never put your knife in the dishwasher. Always wash it by hand and make sure it gets dried immediately after you wash it. Now the prolonged storage of both of these knives is where things change a little bit. So stainless steel knives, if they go away into storage slightly damp, chances are they'll dry before they develop any rust, so you'll have no issues there. Carbon steel knives, on the other hand, if they go away slightly damp, or if they're in contact with anything slightly damp, they most certainly will rust. Some examples of where this might occur are using those drying mats that soak up a lot of moisture. If you leave your carbon steel knife on one of those drying mats overnight, you'll definitely develop rust. Another common way we see this happening is when people use knife guards with little felt linings on the inside. Sometimes water or moisture will get into those knife guards, and if you put your Japanese carbon steel blade perfectly dry away into a wet guard, it will rust overnight. I'd also like to talk about what tool you use to clean your knife. More specifically, the difference between using like an abrasive scouring pad or a soft sponge or cloth. An abrasive scouring pad, of course, is going to leave scratch marks on your knife. So if you must use one of those to get something that's really stuck on, make sure you're using long strokes in one direction. That's what makes you beautiful. And the scratch marks will be less noticeable. On certain carbon steel knives, those with a kurouchi finish, this will definitely wipe away if you are too aggressive when you're cleaning, especially when you're using a abrasive scouring pad. So if you have a kurouchi knife or a carbon steel knife with like a really nice polished finish, make sure that you're using something that's not abrasive to wash it. Now finally, I'd like to make one more point about carbon steel and storing it over long periods of time. This is, again, one of the main distinctions between storing a stainless steel knife and a carbon steel knife. If you're using your carbon steel knife on a daily basis, this isn't super important. But for instance, if you're in between jobs, taking a month off between one kitchen to the next, or maybe you're a home cook and you're going away on vacation for a couple weeks, it's important to oil your knife using Tsubaki oil, knife care oil, before you leave, because carbon steel knives left without oil on them for weeks or months can slowly develop rust over time, just because of the moisture and other things in the atmosphere around it. Finally, the last thing we'll talk about is maintaining the handles on these knives. Typically, a Western style knife is going to have a triple riveted, super robust handle on it that you can really beat up and you don't really have to do much to maintain. Again, if it goes in the dishwasher a bunch of times, any material is going to start to expand and contract and warp over time. So again, avoiding the dishwasher. Most Japanese knives are going to have natural wooden handles on them, which require a little bit more diligence and maintenance. It's a good habit to oil your knives using beeswax or some other form of mineral oil to keep them hydrated and keep them from expanding and contracting and warping, cracking, or maybe falling off over time. Again, avoiding the dishwasher is super important with natural wooden handles, as this is just going to accelerate the process of destroying your handle. Now, with all of that said, in our experience here at the shop, Japanese handles are still very resilient and rarely fall off. And if they do, just give us a shout and we'll make sure we fix it up for you. So there are many different ways to store your knife. Off the top of my head, I can think of like knife guards, little plastic sleeves that slip onto your knife, magnetic storage options, many of which we carry here at the shop, including those magnetic bars or maybe a magnetic block. Further to that, note the knife block is a pretty classic storage option, and then there are other like slots storage options that are found or used like in your drawer. Now, generally speaking, all of these options are totally fine. We would just implore you to make sure that the edge of the knife is your main concern when storing the knife. You never want it coming in contact with anything else, scraping across something, banging into other utensils. So whatever storage option you choose, make sure the edge is protected in that storage option. When removing or inserting your knife into the storage option is typically where the most damage will happen. So make sure that if you're using a knife block, you're using the spine of the knife to guide it into the slot rather than the cutting edge. Make sure that the depth of the slot is such that you're not going to break the tip off of your knife if you happen to drop it in there as well. When using the magnetic bars, especially with a metal bar, make sure you're not dragging the knife as you pull it off of the metal bar. Rather, turn the knife onto the spine and gently remove it off. And then when you put it back, onto the spine and roll it over onto the blade, and you'll make sure you don't scratch your knife up. Now, things happen sometimes, and maybe your knife, Western style knife, gets burnt somehow. We've had lots of people bring in like melted handles to the shop, and though Japanese handles might not be quite as resilient, they are much easier to change out if anything does happen. So if you like burn your handle or otherwise destroy it somehow, very easy to replace a Japanese handle, whereas Western style handles can be a lot more expensive, time consuming, and difficult to repair. All right, guys, so there you have it, a knife care maintenance 101 video. If you have any other points that you would like to make, maybe you have a lot of experience using Japanese knives or any knife in general, and you have some good tips and tricks about how to properly maintain them, make sure to leave them down below. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like, comment down below, subscribe to our channel, and share with your friends. We've always got lots of cool giveaways going on, so make sure to keep tuning back in to see what we've got going on at the shop. So until the next video, stay sharp.